Welcome to Adult Forum. I'm Pastor Hilly. Today is a first for us here at Adult Forum. We are doing, well, it's a first for two reasons. It is our first ever Adult Forum book club. And secondly, we have returning guests to Adult Forum, but not just one returning guest, three. Sitting next to me here at Adult Forum Studios here in Whitehall, Ohio. That's not a real place. It's just my office. Brewer extraordinaire, Zane Lallie, right there.
How's it going?
In the box that I'm seeing is my good friend, IT extraordinaire. That's not a real thing. IT web designer, Alan Webb.
Hello.
And then underneath us is professor extraordinaire. See, I'm trying to give everybody an extraordinaire title.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Nate Jackson, professor of philosophy and all sorts of things over at Capital University. And what we're talking about today is the book titled The Book, written by Alan Watts. It was written in 1966. A little bit about Alan Watts before we dive into it. Alan Watts was born in January of 1915, passed away in 1973. He was a British philosopher and writer and speaker, and he was known, especially in the West, for popularizing Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism. Something I just learned about him the other day when doing some background research was that he was actually ordained an Episcopal priest in 1945, left the ministry in 1950, so 5 years after ordination. And then he moved to California, where he became on staff and teaching at the American Academy of Asian Studies, which I think is pretty cool. His best-selling novel, or his best-selling book, I should say, not novel. His best-selling book was called The Way of Zen, 1957. His favorite book that he wrote is titled Nature, Man, and Woman, which was 1958. But again, our conversation will be his book, The Book, 1966. So that's the catch-up. Gentlemen, I know you guys have all had the opportunity to page through it, read it. You've probably read it more than any of us.
Handful of times.
Yeah, so this whole idea came from a conversation I had with Zane. So I just kind of I got some book club style questions. But let's just start with the easy one. People's initial thoughts to the book, initial thoughts to how Alan Watts is writing, just initial thoughts.
All right. I'm gonna say I really like the initial frame, right? Right. So in that introductory chapter, the explanation of why this thing is called the book, right? The purpose, thinking about giving it to a kid. Would you want to communicate a list of facts, right? Would the point of reading it to be a kind of change in perspective or outlook? I thought that was a really interesting and helpful way to begin the book. And it was a kind of a different, orientation, I guess, into reading. So I thought that was a really cool experience.
Oh, absolutely. And that was one of the things you pointed out to me is, and maybe you can speak to this, the idea of what a pillow book is and how he sets up that framework.
Right. That was an additional draw for me too, was putting it in the idea of passing this theoretical book down and what kind of knowledge that would contain. Because I feel throughout history, we've had all kinds of things that have filled that void in one way or another, but without it being so specific to one person or to one identity, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and isn't the example that he uses kind of in Eastern culture the Karma Sutra, right?
Right.
We can't talk about sex. Parents don't have conversations with the children about sex. But the book that you leave on the pillow, hence the pillow book, is the Karma Sutra. So here's all the stuff that you need to know, but I'm not going to have this conversation. So I hope that works for you.
Pulling out.
Yeah, right. This is not the thing that we're going to talk about really ever. But at the same time, there's going to be some kind of introduction. It's an experience that people have, right? And so there needs to be some way of communicating about it, some way of making sense of the experience. I thought that was awesome.
Especially the taboo.
You seem to make the case a little bit that what we currently have isn't really sufficient. Like,
Oh, yeah.
if you just hand somebody the Bible, they're not going to be able to make heads or tails out of it.
No, it's
Right,
very
And
true.
pretty much all books for any of religion or any practice as such, it's like, these are all old books. So maybe we could have a conversation about what a modern version might look like and what it would contain.
Yeah.
It's an interesting way to go about it.
And I think it's fascinating. I mean, looking at the subtitle, if you will, it's called On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. So to think about like self-awareness being, to think about the comparison to the Karma Sutra, self-awareness and sexuality being equal taboos, which is just a really kind of fascinating apples to apples kind of thing. Because I don't know if it is, or maybe maybe one is a taboo of a thing that we don't talk about, and the other is a taboo of the thing that we don't know how to talk about, which I think that those are similar yet different.
Yeah.
You know? Huh. All right, so here's the question. When you think back to reading the book, if you had to pick one word to describe kind of the book, like your one word elevator pitch, what would be the one word you would pick to describe the book?
One word?
Mm-hmm.
Would a phrase work?
Sure.
All right. One that stuck in my head while I was going through it was Corey Taylor of Slipknot, and he has a lyric that says, "Forget the freak, you're just nature," which seems to be like what he keeps repeating over and over again. It's like all the things we currently have tell you that you're something else. People are a different creature. We're separate from nature, but he tries to make the case that we are nature.
Mm-hmm.
So, and how alienated that can make people feel, like you're a freak, you're something else, but in all actuality, you're a natural part of this world.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. No, I like that one a lot. Man, the one word is difficult because now I'm just like hyphenating stuff. Right, but like I don't know, something like our favorite illusions, you know? Right, because there's kind of a series of criticisms of the ways in which we're kind of trapped or very much like beholden to this idea of like separateness from one another, separateness from nature, right? And thinking about the ways in which we impose order on nature or order on perception even, right, as something that's like inevitable and like deeply rational or something like that. And so, yeah, there's this way of like calling out our favorite illusions, which
He likes to do that.
Yeah, it's a good time.
I've read a couple of his other books that he tends to like to tell, what does he call it? The double bind, which is people getting stuck in an idea, basically, that contradicts itself, and how a lot of things that people believe or think are that way are very contradictory. And that's a theme in this book as well as his other books. So he keeps that going.
Nice.
And we'll get to this in a little bit, but on that topic, he writes a lot about the idea that it's not, existence isn't binary and at odds with one another, but everything's on a spectrum, right? And so if we understand our experiences as being on a spectrum, then it allows a lot more like wiggle room for the experiences of creation, as opposed to saying, well, like this idea has to be black and has to be white. So we set these unnatural dichotomies that also don't exist within their own framework.
Right.
You know?
The duality of man, as cliche as that is.
Right. Because it all works in conjunction with each other.
Right. Yeah. One word.
For me, I think it would either be perspective or reality, because I feel like those are two. Having read it several times, for me, it's perspective, because that's what I come back to. And Alan and I actually talked about that a little bit when I saw him this week. Reading things like this in particular, helps me to change my perspective on just how I view life and interactions and how the space moves between us and things like that. Yeah, actually, I think reality kind of just plays into that, because then that's just your illusion of reality, or what you perceive it to be, versus how it actually is or isn't.
Nice. The word that I kept coming back to was relationship, because the core of everything is the relationship with us and ourselves, with us and the world around us, with, like, is our relationship, or are our relationships set up again on a spectrum? Are we seeing our relationships as black and white, or black versus white, or, all these sorts of things. And so it's about, how do we understand our relationship with ourselves, with the world around us, and with all these other sorts of things. So I was thumbing through it the past couple of days just to brush up on it. And that was even going through like the highlighted bits and the underlined bits. The thing, that keep popping up was, how do we understand our relationship? But how do we understand our relationship with absolutely everything? And then how do we understand that our relationships with each thing also impact those relationships with each thing, right? Like, it's all spider webs. They're not linear paths,
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's that whole idea that you can't separate the person from their surroundings and the people that are around them.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. He makes that comment. He makes the comment that you can't have an individual outside of culture, because like, we are so formed by that culture, and an individual in and of itself, there is no culture around it. It's kind of like early on when he talks about space and movement and balls and that sort of thing. And he goes, if you have one ball in a vacuum, it can't move because there's no relationship to anything else. And if you only have two balls, they can only move in a line. And then you have three balls, and that, I don't know how, like, there you go. You got extra dimension. You got three balls, and it's a plane. And then only when you have the fourth ball do you create like the three dimensions, right? So if you have an individual and pull them out of a culture, out of a context, then it really kind of destroys that sense of awareness, because you can't have self-awareness if there's nothing to be in relationship with.
Like, he talks about the person as a whole at one point, and how you can't remove an arm or a head of somebody and it still is a person, because now you have removed some of its parts. And I think that's kind of what you're like, everything makes up everything.
Yeah.
So as long as you're in some kind of spatial connection between several points, it's all part of the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the individuality point, like, I don't know, I think it's an interesting intellectual exercise, right? Like, you ask people, like, who are you, right? And then they'll start saying stuff, like, as they do. Tell you about their job, their family. Maybe they start naming some, like, personality traits, right? Some, like, things they like, things they don't like, blah, blah, blah. And then the question is, like, well, like, what makes you that, and, like, how do you know, right? So some of those are just going to be like directly relationships, right? So you say like, well, I'm a dad and I'm a husband, and like, these are my friends. Like, you're talking about your relationships. When you start talking about like tastes and interests and, desires and even like your own personality traits, like, well, that because like of certain feedback that's like in the world, right? That through the recognition of other people. So if you're like, well, like, one of the things about me is that I'm awkward funny, it's like, well, how do you know that? It's like, I talk and people laugh, like, ha, right? That's social, right? That's context dependent. And so trying to get people to talk about like the individual outside of any context, right? There's not a whole lot to talk about.
No, that's very true. Yeah. which I mean, so I don't know. How do you think Watts would have the nature versus nurture conversation? You know what I mean? Because they're obviously both very, very important. You know what I mean? But would he give you like a 70-30 split? Or for him, would it be a nonsensical question because they are both the same thing?
I think for me, that would be my answer, is that you can't have one without the other, because both of those just play into each other. Your nature is you, like it's you as a human and as an individual, or however you see it, versus the nurture is what you're around, which is just society, and that's what makes up the whole. So you can't have the whole without the sum of the parts.
Yeah. And maybe even in asking that question, I'm falling into that trap that he talks about. So he talks about this idea of the game of black and white, and thinking about like the game of tag, where you don't have winners. Like one kid gets tagged and then the other kid gets tagged, and it's play and it's free form, and it just kind of doesn't have a beginning and an end, but there's not winners and losers. And like this is creation on this sliding scale, you know, like the rotation of the seasons. Like winter never wins, right? Like it's winter, then spring, then summer, then fall, you know? And he writes a lot about the issues that happen when we change it from the game of black and white to the game of black versus white, when suddenly we have to have winners and we have to have losers, because it creates this chasm between the two, and it makes us like adversarial as opposed to people playing in this game together. And so, you know, I think that'd be the case. I think that if you asked Alan Watts, hey, nature versus nurture, which one's more? He would like, you're really missing the point. You're saying who wins, black versus white, when the idea is that it's the game.
It just is.
Yeah, it just is.
Yeah, so like thinking about that, you know, the questions like nature versus nurture, or, you know, where is nature and where is nurture? Like those concepts, I think nature and nurture can have, like, they help us do things, right? Like they are a conceptual apparatus that help us go about the world in some kind of, you know, successful way. I'm not eaten by a bear, I guess. But, right? Like, but that's all they do, right? We make a mistake, I think, for Alan, when we sort of create objects out of these concepts, right? And then try and force the world or force experience to fit into them, right? And like building on the points made earlier in this conversation, right? Like, you know, Alan's talking about, you know, it's all nature, right? We make this mistake, right? When we want to say, well, there's something sort of extricated from nature and apart from it, and somehow like bears a kind of relationship to it where it subordinates nature. Like, no, both of those categories would arise out of nature, right? Like there is kind of a fundamental thing here, and that is nature.
It's true.
I was thinking about this today, just kind of in a loose way, thinking about nature and the way that, like, the phrase, the word organically is used. People are like, oh, I want to do this organically. And I think that sometimes semantically, the word organically is used synonymous with haphazardly, or without thought or preparation. Oh, well, you know, I'm just going to go in there and do what I do, and organically what's going to happen happens. But when you think about the idea that, like, organically and haphazard are, in fact, not in any means synonyms, right? Like, the atmosphere is not haphazard, right? Like, all of these things work together in a very tight-knit way that it's why that, you know, like, we exterminate mosquitoes and suddenly frogs die, and like there's this ripple effect. And this all happens in this really kind of delicately balanced ecosystem, in a way that shows the intentionality of organic organisms, right? Or the intentionality of the world, and just like the power of, you know, what nature can do, which, I don't know, almost gets me in this weird like headspace of, often we all like to take words and use words with the definitions we want them to have, as opposed to actually like the meaning that they may have. And Lord knows I'm as guilty of this as anybody. Y'all know that better.
It's all good.
Yeah.
It's part of the process. People play with words.
That's it.
They're supposed to be definitions of reality, kind of.
Yeah.
So, thinking of like the organic haphazard language, right? Like, I guess we use haphazard to mean something like not easily organized, or like not organized
Messy.
in forethought or something like that. Right. So like I would describe my office as haphazard.
Mm-hmm.
People at Capitol probably would describe it using other words. But whatever, it's fine. It's fine. We can have meetings elsewhere. Right. Whereas organic, like there is some kind of principle of organization in like organic interactions. They're just complex and like built on systems that like don't totally, boil down to like a simple organization, or like maybe just like a couple of variables even, or something like that. Like there is organization, it's just not the kind of thing that we can like feasibly describe.
No, it's very true. And maybe that organization is one of the things that we can't see in our perspectives. But again, that organization is from a perspective other than ours, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not going all churchy on this. I'm literally thinking about Nate getting eaten by a bear, right?
Yeah.
If you were eaten by a bear, I could be like, he was haphazardly eaten by a bear. But no, the bear was not haphazard about it. The bear was hungry and saw Nate and decided that it wanted to eat. You know what I mean? Like that makes a lot of logical sense. You know what I mean? Like,
Would that be organically eaten by the bear then?
I think he would. Yeah.
I am not organic. But yeah. No. Like there would be organization for the bear, right? There would be like I'm out in nature for some stupid reason. I don't know why I'm doing that. And then, right, the bear has that sort of background. It's hungry. It looks at me. It's like, that dude's slow. There's all kinds of like, organization in some way, but it isn't the kind of thing that like is easily categorized. And in this scenario, I'm eaten by a bear, and so that's not really at the forefront of my concern.
Right.
Yeah.
Going to Alan's comment, one of the other things that Alan Watts talks about in his book is he talks about how often we confuse our metrics with the things that they are measuring. And there's this great line in there that, what was it? The equator is a line that goes all the way around the world, but you couldn't tie it in a bow on a package, right? And so the idea that often we get so caught up in the metrics and how we're measuring in the results of our measuring. If we use metrics and like this one is good and this one is bad, again, it gives us that adversarial black-white thing. And we're arguing metrics. I think it's in this book that he makes the comment of, it's like seeing seeing a road sign that says, Columbus 20 miles away, climbing on top of the sign and going like, hey, I'm here. But when we confuse our metrics with the reality,
right?
I mean, and that was that idea, especially that equator quote, was, I'd say when I got done reading it the first time, one of the things that really kind of stood out, because I think that happens a lot.
Yeah. Right. Like, we do, right? Like, I think we do treat the ways of measuring as the real thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like
I thought I recall him making the argument that Western philosophy, we tend to want things measured, and Eastern philosophy is a lot less rigid in that way. I know that's one of the common themes that comes up in his books is comparing Eastern and Western philosophy. So,
Sure, with one being a definite beginning and end versus one that's a little bit more ambiguous, where the measurement really isn't a measurement. It's more of a, I don't want to say an emotional, maybe spiritual standing, if that makes sense. When you're in comparison with like an Eastern and a Western style, a lot of Western major religions has a major beginning and a middle and an end to life in general and how it works and just the whole structure of it, versus like an Eastern where it's more of another main theme I would say would be consciousness, where it's, you're not performing these things for a beginning or an end or the middle. You're doing them in the now. You're here and you're present, and that is your, for lack of better terms, your measurement isn't I'm doing this because in the end it will get me to where I need to be. It is, I am doing this because here I am and this is what needs to be done, and being conscious of that.
He makes the comment that as the ocean waves, humanity peoples.
I love that part.
Yeah, it's either humanity or creation, one of the two,
Yeah.
right? And this idea that we all come out and kind of go back in, and again, it's that interconnectivity that we see in almost like reincarnation, or again, in a lot of those kind of like Eastern ideas.
Thinking of it as a verb and less of a noun, like instead of people, you are peopling.
Yeah. Which to connect a couple of dots, Nate's earlier comment about how we describe ourselves is A, relationally, or B, the things that we know about ourselves that we've learned by comparing the information that we've received, whether that's music or food or whatever the case may be. I was reading today Jeff Tweedy from Wilco, his book, How to Write One Song, and he makes a comment in there that we should, when we define ourselves, aim to define ourselves more by verbs instead of nouns, because the verb is like who we are because it's what we do.
Right.
Like, I want to be loving or caring or supporting, etc., as opposed to saying like I am a firefighter, like period, because that really doesn't tell me a whole lot.
Yeah,
and that's also going to being in the moment instead of you are a person who does things. You are peopling. You are actively doing that thing, and that thing is being alive.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot less cold that way. It makes you more present.
Yeah.
Because it requires action.
Yeah.
That's probably what he was trying to get at with that, I assume.
And he also kind of sets up just the way that we live our lives. He does a great job of making really great points and then showing us the speed bumps that are in our way of kind of getting to that place, right? Like, so one of our biggest speed bumps of living in the now is the fact that our culture is set up in a way that we're always preparing for the next thing. By the time you're not out of first grade, you're getting ready for second grade, elementary school, middle school, college job, promotion, right? And that's all counterintuitive to just sit in the moment and be there. And if you do have that, if you cultivate that ability to sit there or to like disappear from this forward motion of expectation, then the culture is like, well, why are you being lazy?
Right.
That's Western culture, and probably I think he makes the case that Christianity in general, it causes people to have serious anxiety because there's always some step that you should be taking. You're always supposed to be doing better or getting better and measurably better. And and it just causes people to be a ball of nerves and not live here and now.
And we see that a lot, right? We have the Protestant work ethic, which is I'm going to work myself to death, right? We glorify like the Pilgrims who came over to the New World and like slaved to build this, a new culture. We have Jesus who again worked himself to death in another way, right? Like, and then before like Acts, right, the 5th book of the New Testament, first book that's not a gospel, we get the stoning of Saint Stephen and these early martyrs who like worked for the faith to the point of death, right? So yeah, imbued in this Christendom is this idea that a high virtue is suffering for the sake of the cause, which is the saints and martyrdom and all that sort of thing. And, working ourselves to death, I remember in graduate school doing classes on Paul, and where we would look at all the Pauline letters that make up the majority of the New Testament, and we had to plot out on a map when and where Paul lived where. And it was this whole kind of like, oh my gosh, this guy like went around the known world like 3 times and, wrote from here to there. And it was this glorification of work, which again, all feeds into that.
I think from at least an Eastern perspective, like it's a waste of life then almost. I wouldn't say they would classify it as a waste of life, but in a Western sense, we would, because it's you're living to work and to do nothing but work. And he makes a point in the book about the idea of work is to make money, and to make a lot of money, you'll be happy, and to make your family happy, you need to go to work every day and then come home and pretend that you didn't just work all day, and be happy and energetic and playful, and then do it all again without any room for yourself and understanding and figuring out why you feel like you're here. And I think that it's a strange juxtaposition, but I like that he touches on that a couple times throughout the book.
Yeah.
It's a divorcing of what you enjoy or naturally want to do from what you do every day. So like you're earning money to do something you enjoy versus doing something you enjoy to make money.
Right.
Yeah. No, yeah, because I remember that comment, because you've made that comment to me a million times, the whole, like, are we living to work or are we working to live?
Right.
Right. And I think that when we start asking ourselves those kinds of self-reflective questions, that's one of the things that kind of helps, like, he puts us on that path of, like, that's how we start identifying our ego and shattering the ego, right? I love his comment where he's comparing us to birds and eggs and whatnot. And he goes, the ego is the egg and the bird is the self-realized individual, right? But we have to kind of crack through the egg before A, we're out of it, and then B, before we learn how to fly. And the other thing I love about that is I always remember hearing somewhere that the way baby birds learn how to fly is when they get of a certain age, however many days or whatever it is, the mother just kind of launches them from the nest. I was like, all right, you're old enough. You need to be able to do this now, right? So I love this idea that even after the shell is cracked, even after we escape our ego, it doesn't mean that it's easy. Like, we shed the ego and then we get launched from the nest.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, it's that kind of but again, that's that forward motion in life, which I think is a good thing to be aware of, but yet it's different than the looming anxiety that we project ourselves, right? Like, because it's one thing to say, like, all right, today was a really good day, tomorrow is another day, and life there continues to be up and down, right? We're playing tag back and forth. It's
right.
Another thing to say, all right, today is a good day, but I still have to worry about my 401k. You're like, one of those is a true statement, and the other one of those is kind of like self-created anxiety in this way that kind of robs my right now.
Right.
I have to assume he picked ego as the word to use because that's Freudian, isn't it?
Right.
And he's basically the epitome of Western psychology.
Yeah.
So I guess
he does mention he uses ego, but I'm pretty sure he says, like, he doesn't mean in a Freudian way. It's just a word he's using.
Okay.
But
which is interesting that you can use that word when
right. It's kind of like we were talking about earlier. certain words have meanings and certain
Common parlance.
Yeah, it
We
almost
take it
makes
for granted
it's like
without
a
giving
type,
Freud credit. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Huh.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can find it.
No, as you're looking that up, one pull quote I wrote down. I came back across it today. Watts writes, "Faith is the attitude of allowing the spontaneous to be spontaneous in its own way and in its own time." Which, just rereading that, I was like, yes, I would sign off on that. Every church in America, if you need a mission statement or a slogan or something like that, allowing the spontaneous to be spontaneous in its own time is pretty much the best thing I could think of. I'm gonna get run out of the ELCA probably, but it's but what a brilliant idea. I mean, from a theological perspective, to let the Spirit blow where it will, from a Christian theological perspective, or from a nature perspective, like things will happen, and allowing spontaneity to happen. Yeah, I mean, to carve out that spontaneity exists, which again breathes life into something. Because if there's no wiggle room for spontaneity, then everything's mechanical.
Yeah.
The faith isn't forced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It happens in its own way, in its own time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You find something?
Yeah, so I'm actually glad Alan brought that up, because the first time I read it, I thought the same thing. I was like, I think that's a good.
Talking about the Freudian ego.
Yeah, so it's in the first chapter. He says, the most strongly enforced of all known taboos is the taboo against knowing who you are or what you really are behind the mask of your apparently separate, independent, and isolated ego. I am not thinking of Freud's barbarous id or unconscious as the actual reality behind the facade of personality. Freud, as we shall see, was under the influence of a 19th century fashion called reductionism, a curious need to put down human culture and intelligence by calling it a fluky byproduct of blind and irrational forces. So even if he's not talking about the Freudian id and ego, it kind of still feels like he is.
Right. Well, it's become synonymous in culture that's what
Absolutely.
it means. The ego being that superordinate, I don't know, person in our head that watches everything we do
Right.
and comments on it, and which is what Freud was getting at, and seems to be what Watts was getting at too.
Mm-hmm. It's coming from a
He
different.
must have had, I don't know, he must have had beef with Freud or something.
Yeah.
Calling him barbaric.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so like calling the id barbarous, right?
Yeah.
Makes a little bit of sense here. Like in the context of a critique of like Western science, right? And that comes up a couple of times, right? So
Yeah.
like,
He spent a lot of time doing that,
yeah,
critiquing the Western philosophy.
it was a good time. I enjoyed it. I was like, I'll take that. And but yeah, right. So like, I can understand that critique of the id, right? So if you see, like, going back to the big critique of like Western science, right? Like, the world is made of, like, he calls them bits, right? Like little bits that bump into each other according to certain laws. And like the fun word in early modern philosophy is corpuscles. Like the world is made of corpuscles because they didn't have atoms, you know. That sort of bounce into each other according to certain laws, and that explains all change. And like that creates a mechanistic universe, right? Including like your biological processes, and insofar as the psychological like rides on like the biological, you know, the background id is just going to be a product of like corpuscles bouncing into each other in a certain way, you know, trying to get you to, you know, propagate the species in some respect. And so, yeah, like that's one way of saying like, well, you know, humans are like nature or natural or whatever, but that's like a hugely mechanistic way of thinking about humans as natural, right? A very much like law-bound one, and one that Freud seeks to control, right, in some respect.
Right.
So,
It's very putting
I'll
everything.
take the barbarous for the id.
It almost seemed like he was calling Freud barbaric, but it does borderline on like fatalistic determinism
Mm-hmm.
when you get that deep into like science and scientific theory. I guess it's probably the reason a lot of scientists lean towards I don't know, existentialism and what is it when you kind of give up hope.
Nihilism.
Nihilism, that's what I was trying to think of. Yeah,
Yeah.
it does kind of lean that way.
Oh yeah.
And I think it seems like Alan's what he's trying to do is get people out of that bind, because that's kind of naturally where science leads, is to that sort of nihilistic, fatalistic determinism.
And something that the book shares in common with one of my favorite novels, which I recommended to you, and I think you read, Everything Matters, by Ron Carey Jr. And that's, in a very long-winded novel sense, that's kind of what it gets at, is it's like you can look at it when you break everything down. It can be nihilistic, as in we exist, we bounce around, we die, we're skin and bones and nothing else happens. Or you can look at it and say, I don't know what happens. So here can be my perspective, like, does everything matter? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But why look at it that way when that's really missing the point?
Right.
The point is it is.
It's not a useful train of thought.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that when Watts writes about faith and uses that word faith, it's always interesting that in this, almost mechanical world of these bits bouncing into one another, faith is spontaneity being spontaneous. Spontaneous.
Hey.
Yeah.
I like spontaneous better. That was good.
Yeah, I like the idea of faith being the reality of letting spontaneity do its thing. Or he writes later that faith is openness, and it's an act of trust in the unknown, right? Because that carves out that reality that even though things are bumping in, there's still the reality of a thing outside of the structure that we've created for ourselves. Which is this kind of like, it's opening the window in a way, right? It's letting in that fresh air, or it's opening that window to get us out of that nihilism, that there could be spontaneity. There could be something outside of this room. And even thinking about that, and with your comment, especially thinking about Everything Matters, he writes a few times about this idea of love, and this idea that love comes from knowledge and not from a sense of duty or a goal, right? Like, love is being aware of our relationships, being aware of the world around us, and engaging out of this moral sense, more so than like, well, I have to, or I'm fearful of the outcome.
There's a lot on having a child and saying you ought to love me, or you should love me because you have to,
right?
Versus there's a certain way he phrases it, and I wish I could remember, but he phrases it much more eloquently. But instead of you have to love me, it's you love me because that is the nature of the relationship.
Right. Yeah. Because, and I don't know, Nate, you and I have talked about this. I mean, you have kids, and we've talked about how whenever they're assigned volunteer hours for school or social clubs, like, it's a really weird thing to have forced volunteer hours, because it really misses the point to it. It strips of any kind of like altruistic virtue.
It does, right? And I don't know, I'll relate this story for like the adult forum people. When I was in middle school, we had to do 50 hours of community service in order to like go from the 8th grade to the 9th grade, right? So over the course of the year, you had to do 50 hours. And I told my dad that, and he said, community services for criminals, and signed the paper. So that tells you a little bit about my dad.
Helping people is a punishment.
Yeah. That's so weird. Right, but like, yeah, there's something like fundamentally funky about like the required forced volunteer thing. And I think there's a couple of things you can like do about it, right? Like one is like you cultivate an atmosphere where like volunteering is a thing that like you want to do, right? Like you cultivate a sense of call, right? You can like model that, right? You can talk about the event heading up to it. There's like a whole bunch of stuff because I get it, right? If you're talking to like a 9-year-old and you're like, we're going to go volunteer for 4 hours, their immediate reaction isn't going to be, that sounds amazing.
Right.
Right. It's just, it's not, that's not how they roll. But there's also this idea that like that attitude is a thing that develops over time. Right. And so having kids actually have the experience of doing like some kind of activity in the community where like they're working like with people who, you know, aren't from circumstances like theirs and that are doing a social good, like they can come to recognize that as something worth doing, right?
It's a positive.
Exactly. And like get to the point where like the motivation's there, but you don't necessarily start from that point. And then you get in these like really weird circumstances. Or you're like my dad and you just sign off on it. I don't know.
It takes a while in child development for kids to realize that there's a world outside of their own.
Mm-hmm.
That's very true.
I'm 35.
It's partly I guess it's something everybody grapples with, but it's that maturity, I guess.
Yeah.
That comes with time, in theory.
Time and a little bit of practice, you know?
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's also, like you said, it's about cultivating that reality that this is the thing we do because this is the thing we do, right?
Yeah.
And so this kind of dovetails back into Watts, because Watts is talking about, you know, again, like that idea of the game of black and white, not the game of black versus white, right? So from a Christian perspective, if the outcome to the game of black versus white is heaven and hell, then you have to do all the good stuff because you want to win. You want to be on the good side of things, which, like, if the reason you're doing good things is merely because you don't want to end up in hell, that's more of like, it says more like questionable things about your base morals than the theology of it, right? Like, that's just kind of weird, right? Like, me doing the right thing because it's right is positive. Me doing the right thing because I don't want to catch an eternal butt whooping, like, that's a different frame, right?
But once the eternal butt whooping is introduced as a possibility, it's really hard to get that one out of your head, right?
Oh, it's very true. It's very true. But like, that's the thing, right? But if we would kind of like alleviate that, right? Because if there's two outcomes, then it's black versus white, right? There's winners and losers. But if we shift to this game of, or black versus white, if we shift to the game of black and white, it's this constant back and forth in creation, right? And we can focus more on the relationship of the gameplay because we're not fear driven by the result of what happens when the buzzer runs out. And I think that like that's kind of quintessentially in the Watts text, which is the point of play is the fact that play is happening and play is the universe.
Yep.
And to live in that moment is to, you know, live in the moment when we're doing anything that we consider as play, right? It's to be in the middle of playing that song or running that race or playing that video game or whatever that we let go of ourselves and we're in that, which is a really different reality than just living out of this fear perpetuation of one day the buzzard is going to hit and I got to make sure I'm on the winning side.
Absolutely.
And there's your metrics and your measuring again. Like if you're living your life to do the right things because at the end of your life you want to go to heaven or you don't want to go to hell, are you really doing it then, or are you doing it for the wrong reasons?
Right.
Like, it's not even the wrong reasons. It's just you're doing it because of a measurable outcome, that you're still giving faith to the unknown, but to
Yeah.
you that is a measurable outcome, whereas you could be doing those things in the moment because it's the thing to do, which really in congruence with faith should match up anyways. If you're doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do in the moment, that should lead up to your still measurable goal, but just don't look at it as a measurable goal. Look at it as what could happen, one of the possibilities, one of the endless things that could happen.
Well, guys, I want to be respectful of your time. I thank you so much for the conversation. We've been talking about the book written by Alan Watts. This is what it looks like. I'll put a Amazon link in the description below for anybody who may be interested. This podcast is part of our Adult Forum series, which is one of the ministries coming out of Faith Lutheran Church right here in Whitehall, Ohio. If you would like to support the ongoing ministries of faith during this socially distant time, ministries that include, again, this podcast, please check the link labeled giving in the description below. Zane, Alan, Nate, thank you guys so much for being part of this. I'm Pastor Hilly. Thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you guys next time.
Thanks for
Always a pleasure. Thank you.